everyone. Welcome to this episode of I'm Not a Robot. Today I have our guest speaker, Hilke Schellmann, with me. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the surname correctly. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Hilke is an Emmy Award-winning journalism professor at the NYU and a freelance reporter covering the ethical implications of AI. Hi, Hilke. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So to start, I'd like to resolve your CAPTCHA first. Since the podcast is called I'm Not a Robot, I'm going to ask you to tell me something that helps me understand I'm talking to a human being and not a robot.
Yeah. I don't think a robot would do what I do because I love singing and I sing all the time, but it turns out I'm tone deaf. So I was kicked out of a choir when I was a kid because I just literally couldn't sing. And I don't think a robot would try to emulate this bad singing.
That's a good answer. I think I would also answer something very similar. Singing is a very human thing when you think about it.
Yeah.
And when did your passion for singing started?
Oh, I think as a kid, I was kicked out of the choir at 10. So I was always singing and loved, dancing. And, we had, my friend and I had like early Madonna dance recitals in the backyard. So, we were always singing and dancing and yeah.
That's really sweet. And when it comes to your passions, when did your passion about AI started?
The one pivotal moment was in November 2017. So I was a reporter. I just worked for Vice on HBO covering student loans, nothing to do with AI. And I was looking for another project. And I was actually at a consumer lawyer conference in Washington, D.C. Those people have nothing to do with AI, probably still today have nothing to do with AI. But I needed a Lyft ride, or I needed a ride from the conference to the train station. So I called myself a Lyft, sort of an Uber. And I chatted with the driver and I asked him, how was your day? And he was like, it's been a weird day. And I was like, oh, yeah. I'm a journalist. I'm like, tell me more. What was weird? And so he actually told me or shared with me that he had a job interview. He called it with a robot. He said it was a robot. A robot called him and asked him 3 questions. He had applied to a baggage handler position at an airport. And I was like, what? Robots doing job interviews? I never heard of it. Took a note and forgot a little bit about it. And then I went to a digital fairness conference, and somebody who had just left a few months later had just left the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was talking and talked about how, they're really worried about some of very basic algorithms that are checking people's employees' calendars. How long are you at work? And sort of they're afraid that maybe there will be, if there are layoffs, they would look at the people who have the longest absentees at their job. But she was worried, moms, mostly moms who do the caregiving, caregiving parents and people with disabilities have the longest absentee times in their protected class. And I don't know, she told me all about this and about hiring. And then I started looking and I was just blown away, because when you go to some of these, even HR conferences, there's so much tech moving into the space, and there wasn't a whole lot of there weren't other reporters. And every time I talked to a job applicant, they thought if human watches their videos or looks at their resumes. And I was like, I don't think what's already out there. So I really felt like it was really helpful to look into it. Little did I know how bad some of these tools are. That came a bit later.
That's super interesting.
I always loved math and tech, and I guess was sort of maybe missing that from my practice. So I have an infinite curiosity to the idea how we quantify humans. Can we quantify humans, right? Can we rank order them? Can we have a mathematical equation about your abilities? I think it's utterly fascinating.
It is really fascinating. And I'm really happy that you had that spark in curiosity and did all the work that you did in AI in hiring. Speaking of which, can you also tell me a bit more about the work that you did about AI in hiring practices for our listeners to also know? Yeah.
So then I started in 2018, right? Really looking into it. And in the United States, and it's also happening in other countries. The UK is already has a lot of AI in hiring. Other countries are a little bit more lacking. Some are faster than others. Germany is it's not a lot of this technology going on. But what we see is for a lot of roles in retail, fast food, truck driving, where you have to hire a lot of workers, we see a lot of AI usage, and we see it all along what HR folks call along the hiring funnel. So we see it maybe in resume screening, right? And if you upload your application to, LinkedIn or Indeed, and all of those job platforms use some form of AI, And we also know that at least 99% of Fortune 500 companies use some sort of digital tool along the hiring funnel, right? And most of them have applicant tracking systems, where it sort of used to be an Excel sheet where you sort of track where people are in the different rounds. But they're all the vendors now have AI built in. I can't tell you which one is turned on and off, but we know that there are those capabilities.
That's very interesting. Looking at your past podcasts and the work that you did, and I remember in one of them you mentioned that right now, if we were to decide to create an AI hiring tool, we can sell that. You mentioned that you pointed out that there weren't enough regulation in this area. Did you see any developments on that lately?
So we see definitely a lot of more sensitivity, and we've definitely seen a lot of folks realizing that AI might not be the magic tool that we had all hoped, right? It's definitely a transformational technology, but I think they're sort of more thinking about, like, in these high stakes environments, be it prison sentences, do you get a mortgage, should you get social services? And I would also count hiring and work as part of that. And the European Union agrees with that, not necessarily with my assessment, but they came to a similar conclusion. But I think it's been sort of lacking to look at hiring. We've looked at facial recognition, right? But like hiring has always been lacking because I think a lot of people just assume, well, you get rejected to jobs many times over. I've gotten rejected for jobs, but it does matter if we get the job that we want, right? And sort of like I get nervous in a job interview because I want to be, I really want the job. And if it's my dream job, a lot of my identity is tied into it. And not only am I going to make money and hopefully be happy, it's like there's a lot riding to it on it. So I do feel that we need to be much more clear and like put guardrails into the industry. Because as you said, anyone can start an AI tool for hiring and can sell it. There's no regulation. There is, obviously there are existing laws about discrimination, certain groups, you're not allowed to discriminate based on gender or race and disability. But the assumption is that everyone who builds a tool will conform to that. And I know for sure that that is not the case, but I also know for sure that a lot of regulators struggle forcing companies and vendors to open the black box and actually assess these tools. So it's actually not quite so easy. So we don't see a whole lot of regulation. We see a little bit beginnings. We see like some local laws in New York City, right? We have an AI auditing law for hiring. Unfortunately, I think it's been 18 companies that have complied with the law and put their audit on websites. And there's probably thousands of companies hiring in New York City every day that use some form of AI in their hiring. So, we see a little bit of change. It may not be enough right this second. So we're still working on getting more.
Okay. And what amazes me is that you mentioned how many Fortune 500 companies use these kind of tools already. And when I talk to our clients at the AI Academy, the biggest response from bigger companies, corporate companies that are in the field is, what are the risks? What are the things that I should be careful about? So I'm really amazed by how many companies still choose to use that, even if they know that there aren't enough regulation out there and the conversation has started, but we're not really there yet. So what do you think makes it so attractive for these companies to use it?
I think hiring is a real pain point for a lot of companies, right? And I think with the advent of job platforms, like LinkedIn and Indeed, and I think they really started with the idea of like, we're going to democratize hiring instead of writing all these, long letters and paper, and you have to find the job description first. Like, it was really hard to kind of apply before. Now you can just see all the open jobs. You just click and your resume gets sent there. And I think that is really wonderful for applicants. Very easy now to apply for a job. I think for a job, but the problem is on the other side is like employers feel they get absolutely overwhelmed by applications. So Google said they get about 3 million applications a year. I think Goldman Sachs got over 225,000 applications for the summer internship program alone. So like these are massive numbers, right? And I think that's why you can tell why my appeal to large companies to use some sort of system, because for a lot of jobs they get inundated by application. This helps them easier screen people. So we see a lot of like AI screens at the beginning of the funnel, right? At the hiring funnel. So like for the rejection, companies use a lot of maybe digital tools, and then when there is a a high likelihood of hiring someone, maybe you're like down to the last 10, 15 or 20 or 5 people, then probably a human will get involved, right? And then you will have a one-on-one interview. So it's not like there's no human in the decision making. It just comes much, much later. And I think it also depends on the business and on the job. Like probably not a lot of companies will use AI screening tools for a CEO job. But they will for like, a lot of retail associates where they have to constantly hire. I mean, some of the large companies in the United States have to hire thousands of people, interview thousands of people every day to have people working in their retail outlets. And, they have to constantly hire. So they feel like this is actually, this might be really helpful.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned that I absolutely love is the focus on decision making, because I think when people are not in this area in hiring and did not do a lot of research on it, maybe when you say AI in hiring, the first thing that comes to my mind is AI hiring me. So I feel like the human element is out of the picture. But after doing some research, I realized there are a lot of companies that embrace these tools, use them. But for example, they use it to have some numbers, some kind of evaluation, and then they do not include it in the decision making. What they do is to, for example, let's say you're hiring someone who needs to do sales. Being confident and being able to hold a conversation is very important. And I've seen some tools that can measure that really well. And it is possible to use that and then have a look at the CV and still evaluate and do the decision making as human and let AI help you with the tools that you will need in decision making. So that was my main takeaway after having a look at this area. So I think it's very important.
And I think AI can be tremendously helpful. I think what irks some job applicants is when some of these tools, like maybe a gamified assessment that looks for like how much is your personality and your traits overlap with the current people in the role. We sometimes see it for these large companies that it's used as a screen. So either you pass or you don't. So there isn't a whole lot of like holistic look at like, okay, this is one data point. Let's also look at this data point. Let's look at your resume. Let's look at your interview, right? Like that isn't often seen by large companies, or it's maybe seen in the later rounds, but not in the early rounds. Like this is a screen, like you want to whittle down the applicant pool to smaller and smaller people. So you use it to reject people. And I do think that, we need to talk about hiring and talk about like what is a more holistic approach. And I'm not saying actually we should go back to human hiring because humans are incredibly biased. We hire people on the time of the day, how hungry we are. Like, if people look like us, if people speak similarly to us, like we have, we unconsciously prefer them, right? Like in women and people of color and people with disabilities have been underrepresented in the workforce, probably because of human hirings, because humans have underestimated them, right? Like, so I'm not saying we should go back to that, but let's not use the sort of biased human hiring and just build it into machine and make it look more objective, right? Let's actually think about what really works. How should we evaluate people, and how can we use technological tools? But what I've seen, I've talked to employment lawyers and others who've taken a look into some of these tools, right? And one told me, well, he looked at 5 tools, and all 5 had biased variables, and he looked and he learned that, for example, the word Thomas was a measure of success, or he had like basketball, football, where hobbies started to come up as a variable of success. So if you had that on your resume, you got a few points more than others. But those can really lead to gender discrimination, right? Because in the United States, often there's more men who prefer football. Actually, there was one tool that another employment lawyer looked at that gave people who had the word baseball on their resume more points and deducted points for people who had the word softball on their resume. And that is clearly a gender disparity, right? Because in the United States context, a lot more men play in like baseball, and women often play softball and like softball. So, the problem is like if you give a tool, the training data is just resumes of people who are successful in the job now. And, a predictive AI tool looks for statistical patterns, right? What are all these resumes in common? So maybe there are a bunch of Thomases in the pile was statistically relevant, right? Or the tool found out that over time, people with the word baseball in resumes were successful at the company they were hired, right? And maybe it was a tech company that had historic gender bias. So there were more men in the company, so that came up, and most of them didn't have the word softball on their resume, right? So we see kind of often bias coming in from the back door because I think a lot of the tools are not closely monitored. So I think that's something, and I think it goes sort of against the ethos sometimes, because I think a lot of companies buy these tools from vendors because they want more efficient hiring, right? They want less labor involved in this. So they're not going to hire more people to start supervising these systems, right? But they do need, I'm not saying you have to hire like an army of people, but I do think you have to like closely monitor these systems over time, because maybe they work at the beginning, but then you feed it more resumes. And who knows what the next variable will be, right? So you have to like keep looking at these tools, like what is coming out of it. And I don't think, there's a whole lot of appetite to do that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. But it's also really difficult to find that balance between, okay, AI tools are biased, but also humans are biased. So when we're hiring, where do we stand? It reminds me a lot of, there was a research that we discussed within the team some time ago. It was on AI in healthcare, and the research suggested that AI responses were more qualified as more empathic compared to those of humans. And first it was a question mark of how is that possible? That wouldn't work, right? But then we realized we should actually look at the situation of what's going on today, because today doctors need to see a lot of patients in a day. So if they have 5 minutes to respond, even if humans are more empathic, you're not going to be able to get a more empathic result if that's just a 5-minute time limit. Yeah. So I found it very similar to what you explained about how we're hiring today is biased enough as well. So maybe we need to spend a bit more time in understanding, yes, AI could be biased, AI tools could be biased, but to some extent, to what extent it's worse or better, which are really hard questions to answer.
The question is also for me, like, if we know about the bias and we built these tools, like the idea that we as humans haven't solved the bias, but the machines magically will solve this bias is sort of a little bit naive, right? That, like, we haven't found a way to hire better. Like, why do we think the machines would just do that job? Yes, they look at everyone the same, right? They don't have the human problem of today I have a bad day and I'm not going to like whoever is in front of me today. There's nothing to do with them. But I think also another problem is that the one size fits all can actually be biased and bring discrimination on as well, because the tools do literally look at everyone the same. But not everyone is the same. So, the problems, we have neurodivergent people, we have people with disabilities, so they're often not represented in the training data, right? Because they're often underrepresented in the workforce. But even if there would be, right, their disability is often so individually expressed. So even if you had one autistic person as part of like the games that you let people play to understand what's their, what are their preferences, it could be that the next autistic person, their disability is expressed much more differently. And so I think, and the tools look for like a statistically relevant traits or variables, right? So the question is like, will we ever be able to include folks that are like, doing work or doing things a little bit outside of quote unquote the median patterns there. So I think that's another thing. Like if we look for statistical patterns, are we catching the people that might absolutely be able to do the job? And in fact, in the United States, if folks with disability can do the job with a reasonable accommodation, absolutely have to consider them. You're not allowed to just reject them. And we're not seeing a whole lot of thinking around these very complicated set of circumstances.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think it is very important to be precautious in these while considering the tools, while testing them as people like you do, because this would also help avoid future harm that can be caused. Because there is already a lot of examples in which how AI tools in hiring, or also in different case studies where it caused a lot of harm. So I think now there's a lot more conversation going around safe AI, ethical AI, but still we're not at the point where we can assure that there won't be some trials on this a couple of years from now.
Yeah. I mean, I hope like some companies, this would be really good for humanity if they could test, if they hire a lot of people and they hire maybe some with their traditional ways and hire some with an AI tool at the same time, and they take everyone in, people that were labeled yes, maybe no. The labels on these persons as they go through the job, right? Like it's some sort of applicant tracking system. Don't tell their managers to unconsciously bias them, but track people over years and sort of understand, well, were the people that were labeled a do not hire 3 years ago, did they really not perform successfully, right? Like, can we have like long-term testing here, like you would do with like maybe medicines, right? You have to, or vaccine, you have to prove that they actually work, and you also have to prove that they work better than already given medication. So let's, that would be really great. I have never heard of that, and I understand why, because this is like takes a lot of money and labor, and like most companies don't have time for that. Also, people move on from their HR jobs, right? They're not there 10 years at the same job to oversee such a vigorous application. But I think it would actually help humanity to figure out and do some of these tools work.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think governments also have some level of responsibility there in initiating this kind of processes as well. But I'm actually happy to see that there's a lot more conversation going on. I also wanted to ask you, because it looks like AI safety will play an important role in the US elections this year. I've seen a lot of movement in that field.
Yeah.
And let's imagine for a second that you're advising to the President of the United States on AI safety on hiring. Where would you suggest them to start? Maybe they'll listen to the podcast and take it into consideration.
I mean, I think really having think through this set of challenges, and I think I would start with demanding much more transparency. And I think it's not enough to just, we have a law in Illinois that if you use AI in video interviews, the companies have to disclose that, because a lot of applicants that I've talked to always thought a human watches their one-way video interviews, right? They get pre-recorded questions and they just sort of record themselves answering. They always thought a human watched it, even though I knew for some specific companies that only used the AI product, that they weren't watched by humans. But the candidates didn't know. But no, in Illinois, if you're based in Illinois, you wouldn't know that an AI uses you, but that an AI is used. But I think the problem is that I call this like sort of forced consumerism, because if you want to have the job and the company sends you an email saying like you have to do this one-way video interview, if you want the job, you're probably going to do it, right? And even if they say they use AI, what are you going to do? It doesn't even help you to understand, is this possibly a faulty algorithm? I think what would really work is like vertical transparency to say, like, first of all, AI is being used, but also tell you how you were scored. And I think that is where maybe the rubber would meet the road, because we would actually understand that maybe variables like Thomas or church or other words people have found in these resume screeners that were biased would actually see the light of day, and candidates could appeal this process. Kind of like when you in the United States, there's like a credit score, like how worthy are you of a mortgage or something. And it's a flawed system, but you can ask for your score every year for free. And you can also appeal the score. If you know, wait, that isn't me, you got the wrong person, you can appeal. But in hiring, we don't know why we were rejected. There's no appeals process to say, like, wait a second, like, why did you use my facial expression? Can you explain this? Or like, why was the word baseball why was that used? It has nothing to do with the job. And, we always, and I think a lot of companies want to do the right thing and they want to hire the right way. But I think we really have to think about, like, okay, what are the 5 skills people really, really need in this job? And how can we actually assess for that and not find other ways to assess people? And I think it really troubles me that a lot of the AI tools are calibrated with the people who are already in the job. So what can happen if you don't have a very diverse workforce? You might find the same people again. Also, like, we should really try to find those skills and abilities, and not, what those 50 people in the job already have in common. Maybe they all like snowboarding for whatever reason. But we shouldn't be hiring for that if we're looking for, a sales person, right? Like, somebody has nothing to do with that. In fact, it probably tells you more about your socioeconomic background than what your abilities are for the job.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It feels like there's still a lot of work to be done in AI and hiring, but I look at the future quite hopeful way. I think there is a way in which AI can collaborate with human, even if it's really hard and there's a lot of work to do. I do believe AI can help improve hiring processes a lot, because, as you mentioned, it's very important to keep in mind that today we are hiring in a quite biased way. There are still a lot of groups that are harmed in the long term by AI tools, but also by humans. So
Yeah.
I think AI in hiring could be one of the areas, another area where we see AI and human performing better compared to AI alone and human alone. So I'm hopeful about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful too. And I think helping, I sort of sometimes feel like, oh, I don't want to be a negative Nancy, but I actually feel like actually knowing how these tools work and don't work is actually really helpful to now go in and be like, okay, well, how can we build better tools, right? So I think we need to, and I think one sort of problem is like, I think a lot of vendors are often startups and they need to bring their product to market. And there's a real push to make money back for investors, and science takes time. Evaluating a product takes time. And I think sort of it's problematic because you have to sell the product. I'm not saying that people like sit there and do shortcuts, but I think they don't maybe have the long road to they're like, oh yeah, we tested this quickly and it worked. And but don't think about like, well, what is with people with disabilities? What's there's a lot of people we have to think about that don't look like us, don't act like us. And, we need to bring them into building the tools and also evaluating the tools. And I think some experts I've talked to hope that, some government agencies would maybe pre-license these tools before you are allowed to bring them to market. You have to show the government that you do not do harm. I think it's a great idea. I'm not seeing a lot of political will in the United States or building of an infrastructure that kind of would require, right? That would require actually the government testing those tools and having technical expertise. And I'm not sure if that's on the horizon, but I think radical transparency and forcing companies to open up the black box, and also maybe sort of a public sector building some of these tools and putting that into the public realm and saying okay, we did build, here are the 5 ways it didn't work to build a resume screener that was not biased, but here's one way. Evaluate the tools that you're trying to buy according to this, right? You can put better technology, possibly. I don't know if it's possible, but you could possibly put that into the marketplace and push maybe against some of the vendors' black boxes. And it might help HR managers and companies to push back and be like, hey, we know this way works. How did you calibrate this tool? Maybe we should use the better product that's out there.
I think that would be a really helpful approach, because another issue that I see in solving these kind of problems is liability. Who is going to be responsible after there's a problem? And in general, in AI, there are some discussions, some movement. There's the executive order from Joe Biden that is suggesting some kind of test results that would be presented to the government, which I think is a good starting point also in AI hiring, because in that way, I can set standards as a government that you need to comply with. But at the same time, once you comply with them, I need to approve them and go through them. So there's more than one party that is working on making that technology safer. So I think that would be a good step forward to solve that dilemma of, okay, who's responsible, who is liable? Because I think that creates a lot of problem. And I don't think it's the best incentive to find the solutions if the responsibility belongs to just one party, because obviously no one really knows what can happen, and it's hard to take all that responsibility at once. So hopefully that could be a good suggestion. I really want to send this podcast to the president and see if that could be helpful.
If he picks it up, he has some really good advisors, and we are very grateful that things are moving forward, right? And there is a public understanding that we need to take a closer look at these tools, and we need to put up some guardrails, right? We're still working on how is this going to look like. And I'm a little bit skeptical of audits, because we don't, at least in hiring, we don't have clear standards for that. Also, I've reported on 2 audits that 2 private companies in AI and hiring have initiated, and they were done very differently, and because there are no standards. And one was just a roundtable discussion, really, that was then used for marketing. So you have to be really careful of whitewashing. Also, a system of companies paying auditors. It's a little bit flawed, and we saw that in the last recession in the United States, right, where companies paid third parties to evaluate the mortgages, and a lot of the subprime mortgages, because they were bundled up, they magically became AAA rated, right? And then we had a whole mess from that. So I think we've seen that sometimes there's a conflict of interest there. So I think we really have to think through who should audit these tools? How should we audit them? What are the standards here? We haven't had that conversation. We need to have that conversation.
That's super interesting. Also, it's another great example to how humans can cause bias as well. So maybe we should have AI who's auditing, and then we can discuss the bias in AI in auditing.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
just
it's
think
like,
sometimes, may it be helpful to have, some AI tools, sort of quote unquote, listen into job interviews and tell people who interview candidates like, hey, you said this question differently than last time. Why are you chit chatting? That causes bias. Like, that there might be some feedback that AI may be really helpful for, because it is really good at like, okay, here are the rules. Follow the rules. Did that person follow the rules? And I think that could be actually really helpful.
I actually really like that idea. Instead of talking about how we can improve AI, sometimes we should talk about how AI can improve us.
Like, it's not like that AI magically knows how to do job interviews, right? It evaluates like we do, like the literature, how people do it. We know we have some best practices, right? Like we know that structured interviews where you ask every person the same question is a much, much fairer way than like, just like chatting with people or starting to talk about where did you go to school? Do you know the same people? That is where we see a lot of bias creep in. And we do that as humans. It is like very human for us to try to have a human connection, right?
Yeah.
I think that's maybe where AI tools maybe helpful, maybe actually really helpful to help us.
Yeah, I definitely agree. A very important point, Hilke. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing to start with. I think the most crucial thing is to have people from diverse backgrounds. As you did, you also collaborated with our founder, Gianluca Mauro, on one of the researches on AI biases. I think those are the kind of collaborations, the kind of research that help policymakers, regulators, politicians, and everyone who is trying to help make a difference but don't know where to start. I think you are providing a very important starting point. So thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation.
Methods, like used somehow. I like how maybe Gianluca and I tested some of these tools. I tested them myself, and I don't actually really code. So, if I can test these tools, anyone can, right? Like figure out these methods and like just keep testing these tools before anyone utilizes them anywhere, and see, do they even pass like sort of a very basic test? And that might be a good signal.
Exactly. I think you're a great example to how you don't need to have a specific background or specific knowledge to get started. Because if you're a journalist, you put something from your own knowledge into the table. And I think on that AI table, we need more backgrounds as possible so that everyone can bring their point of view. And then that's the place where we can start making progress on resolving these. Thank you so much. It's been so nice to have you here. Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to close up. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Bye.